right, guys, today we're doing a super deep dive on what it takes to transition from that SDR, sales development representative role, to account executive. Speaking to a lot of you, I know a lot of you put in a lot of work to break into that role, but that's not the ultimate goal, is to remain an SDR. It is to promote to that account executive role where a lot of opportunities open up from both an income standpoint and a career standpoint. So I got Eric on today. We're going to be talking about how we both made this transition, myself doing so at Oracle about 5 years ago, and Eric at a hyper-growth startup company, how he made the transition in just 3.5 months. So I think he's uniquely qualified to speak on this topic because the market's tough out there right now, and there's a lot of people who are in that SDR job. They want to make that jump, but there's just a few roadblocks in the way. So this episode is going to be about breaking down those roadblocks and making sure you guys get to where you want to go. But pass it over to Eric because he's uniquely helped quite a few people in this situation.
Yeah, well, I think this will be really good because, like you mentioned, I was at a 250 person company and went from SDR to AE in 3.5 months. No shame in admitting there was some luck and great timing involved, and we'll definitely get into that. But also for everyone's reference too, like obviously you're a part of the higher levels team now. We've coached hundreds of people breaking in, promoting from SDR to AE. So we've seen a lot of different things, and not only going to talk about just what it takes to actually make that transition, but I also see a lot of SDRs who are like top performers. They're getting impatient and they make an irrational move that actually handicaps their career 2 to 3 years longer than it would have been if they waited at their current position as well. So there's no perfect answer here. We're going to lay out a lot of the variables and things we've seen, good and bad. But I'll feel free to kick us off with the first major topic.
Yeah, I think you laid it out well. If we want to go right into what are some of those common misconceptions that SDRs aren't thinking about or considering when they're looking to make that transition? What are they missing?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and this is the hardest because it's something that I see a lot of times where people do in hindsight, where you feel like you've built a good brand, like you've checked that box, but you haven't maintained it internally over time. So the biggest misconception I would say is that you being like the absolute number one is a guarantee that you get that promotion. Mm-hmm. It certainly helps, especially if you're at a smaller company. It helps you have a lot of leverage. But if you haven't maintained those relationships with top performing account executives, obviously your SDR manager, but going out of your way to get FaceTime for the inside sales manager that would hire you as an AE. And we can definitely continue to break it down because just asking them for time is not appropriate. Like there are many right and wrong ways to do that as well. But this is the biggest thing I see where, to no fault of a high performing SDR, you get in the role, you kind of check your boxes the first 3 months of building a good internal brand, and then your head's down for the next 6 months trying to hit and attain and exceed your quota, make a fair amount of money as an SDR, and position yourself for promotion. And so many times you get really good at being an SDR at the sake of neglecting building those internal relationships. And so again, this isn't like, we can get into how to actually build those relationships effectively, because it's not like every single week you have to blow everyone up, make sure you're friends and all these different things. But that is probably the number one thing where I see is people get 12 months into it, they've hit number one. Someone who maybe is like number 2 or number 3 is at 120% of their number. You've consistently been at 140, but that person has a way more public brand, way better perception within the company. Mm-hmm. And you're actually, even though you're the clear number one and you've convinced yourself that you're going to do it better than everybody else, and you have a strong likelihood that you could, you're now playing catch up when it comes to these interview rounds. You're getting FaceTime for the first time with this inside sales manager when your peer otherwise has built good rapport, gone out of their way to meet with them, and all these different things. So there's more I could get into. I'll pause there as like the first major one. But I think that's the biggest thing I see, because we work with a lot of top performers, is you get so obsessed with how do I crush the day-to-day of the SDR role. Yep. You're not playing the chess alongside of that and the strategy of the overall political game of your company.
Yep.
So
yeah, I think what you covered is the most important thing that people neglect. They don't take the time. They just get zeroed in on nailing their SDR metrics, and they don't take the time to start meeting reps on some of these teams, like some of the other account executives, and doing that networking and building that brand. Another problem I see is that a lot of SDRs think they're God's greatest gift to earth. I think we're all guilty of this when they're just crushing their metrics and they think that automatically means they're going to succeed in the account executive role just because they're good at cold calling, emailing, booking meetings, generating pipeline. But account executive managers are smart enough to know that there's a whole other host of skill sets, like running discovery calls, for example, that are important to the AE job, that they can pretty easily determine when you speak with them if you've given yourself that experience or gotten some shots on net running your calls on your own. I think that's a big misconception a lot of SDRs forget, is they get really good at setting these meetings. All they're thinking about is getting that opportunity. But when they jump on the customer call, they do their little 30-second intro and they just pass it over to the account executive. And they never take a few calls on your own. And I get it. There's calls you set up where you're like, there's a really good chance of being a good opportunity that is directly going to lead to money in your pocket. I understand why you want the account executives to run some of these, but we all have those meetings where you kind of were on the phone or on an email and you kind of convinced someone to take a meeting and it wasn't that qualified of a meeting. You didn't have much conversation beforehand. Or it might be with like a lower title. I think those are good ones when you're like maybe 6 months in role, you've gotten your feet wet, you're comfortable. Tell the account executive, hey, I set this one up, didn't have much background on the conversation. How about I run this call on my own and you give me feedback? Or if they don't even have time to join, you can just deliver the feedback. But you want to start getting those shots on net and like doing some of those things you would be doing in the account executive role, because that's going to help you stand out when you're interviewing with these managers and trying to make that leap. So I guess from there, a good transition would be, were you doing any of these things when you promoted from SDR to account executive in 3.5 months? What was your experience like making the transition?
Absolutely. And again, this will maybe get into how I kind of went about it in an unorthodox way. And again, I'll get into this. Like, certainly luck and timing was a big part of me promoting in 3.5 months. But for instance, if you're at a big company, if you're at a small company, there's going to be opportunities when you're brand new. The first time you're presenting or doing anything in front of like a larger audience, you have to absolutely crush that. And so like a very real thing for me, just coincidentally, I joined a startup that was launching a new product. My third day ever as an SDR, they had a company-wide competition for all the SDRs to pitch the new product because they were training us on it. They were getting us ready to cold call for this for the first time ever. And I, as a third day at the company SDR, literally finished second in the entire competition. And again, it's a 250 person company. There's like 10 SDRs, but I was number 2 on my third day on the job. So these, like, I presented to enterprise account executives, the VP of marketing was there. There were several like field marketers and other people on this call. And that is an immediate way that I was able to leverage my brand. So it's not necessarily that you have to seek out these opportunities and be too much of a try-hard, but naturally at any organization you're at, you're gonna get face time with a broader group of people. You have to be on the ball. On the ball doesn't mean you're like running the whole call yourself or like drawing unnecessary attention to yourself. But anytime you're called upon, anytime you are asked to do anything, you do it at an exceptional level and act like you've been there and done that before. So that was a huge key, like literally my first week on the job that got me noticed. Then as an example, people are like, wow, lots of potential. Let's see what happens. The first month I did pretty well. The second month I hit my quota. The third month I started to exceed my quota. So every month was an upward trajectory. And then making a long story short, by the time I was 3.5 months in, the new product was ready for the full-on launch. They created a dedicated team of account executives specific to that product. And there were 2 people in front of me, an SDR who had been there for a 1.5 years. He left to go to a competitor, and then another another SDR that was up for promotion said he didn't want it because the product was new and he wasn't sure what he did. That guy's like a lifetime SDR. I digress. Wouldn't have done it myself. But at that point though, there were still other SDRs that were maybe like 6, 7, 8 months of tenure that weren't promoted either. So they took a chance on me because I had come in, I had crushed that presentation, I'd gone in and like done really well on my quota. And also in the meantime, and what I kind of left out of that part is because I did very well on the presentation, because I had set a couple meetings for this new product, marketing on a weekly basis, if not like 2 or 3 times a week, was pinging me to say, hey, what's working on the phones? What is getting you these meetings? When I set up a meeting for an account executive on this new product, because they were heavily incentivized to sell this new product, and that meant that they could get drastically more money for closing a $50K deal of the new product versus a $50K deal of the old product, they would get paid almost twice as much on the new product. So when I was setting meetings for them, for the new product, that was getting me FaceTime with them. And they're like, what are you doing? How are you getting these meetings? How can I talk to my customers and try and sell them this new product as well? And by me being in a perfect position to be really the first that came in and learned how to do that very effectively, and also not sharing it with anyone and everyone, but sharing it with more strategic personas within the organization, they're like, hey, I don't know how this is gonna go, but if anyone's gonna figure it out, it's this person right here, right? And that's very much representative of how much leverage you have as a startup, and something I'm sure I would love to pick your brain on your experience.
Yeah.
At Oracle or the bigger companies of the world, there is that rigid structure. So it's not like if I was at Oracle and did exactly what I did for 3.5 months, I would have been promoted. There's a 0% chance. I have no shame in saying that. But hopefully that story illustrates like the opportunities for you to pick your brain. And when you're trying to meet with top performers, when you're trying to network and build your brand, you're not reaching out and bullshitting and saying like, hey, could we get a coffee or something? And that may be appropriate here and there, but they wanted to talk to me because first and foremost, I had results.
Yeah.
So it's like, I'm coming to the table, even if it's something small, like, hey, I noticed, like if I'm covering an account executive and I noticed 3 people at Toshiba downloaded a white paper, if I see that, I'm going to prospect out to them, but I would actually ping my account executive. This is one thing that got me noticed as well. I'm like, hey, I'm already actioning these leads, but I want you to know a cluster of engineers based in like Minnesota all just downloaded a white paper on our next thing. And so doing these types of things and little things to go above and beyond, you're getting noticed, you're creating a larger surface area with the right people and allowing yourself to then have those more personable conversations and quote unquote build your brand.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'll pause because I could keep going. But
yeah. These are the ideas you guys should be thinking about. Like, yeah, you might not need or even have the opportunity to do all of that, but now when you go to the managers and you ask for coffee or whatever variation of that, you want to meet with them, you have stuff to show them, like, here's what I've been doing. You're not just, again, God's greatest gift to earth because you hit your number, you almost feel entitled. Like, yeah, you should be meeting with me. Like, I'm the number one SDR. I've been crushing my number. Like, when are you going to hire me? Stuff like that. Like, it's going above and beyond, and there's different ways to do that at every company. Part of that is like, and again, this is a whole conversation in itself, like working at a startup versus a bigger company. There's different opportunities and ways to do that because you're right, the bigger companies, and I guess I can get into my experience making the transition too, are more rigid. Like the big companies, yes, it's like physically impossible to promote in 3.5 months. They just simply won't allow it. There's too many people, too much pipeline to fill open positions. They have people who've been in seat 10, 12, 15 months who have been crushing it that they're just going to hire them as opposed to someone who's been doing some of these outside the box things for 3 months. But you better believe once you start doing that, you're on their radar. So, I mean, my transition, and a lot of this has to do with timing and what's going on in the market too. I would say mine was more standard where I was an SDR, I was good at my job, I improved every quarter in seat. Spitballing the numbers, I think I was at like 128% Q1, and then it was like 164%, close to 200%, and then it was like 225, 30% or something. So there was clear upward trajectory. I built a brand like when things were working for me. I think this is an easy way to do this at bigger companies is if you have a cold call script or an email template that's working, just tell your manager, hey, here are the results I'm getting. I'm crushing it for you. I just want to help everyone else out. Can we set up like a 30-minute optional Zoom meeting where I can just run through with everyone what I've been doing? At least from my experience, managers love that. Like when you go out of your way and it's like, hey, on a Friday, like people don't have to join, but I just want to run people through what's been working. That's like one quick way to build your brand. But beyond that, I really just networked with account executives in the group I wanted to join so that when I then met with the manager, I was like, here's what I know about your group. Clearly communicate what I've learned, what I've done in this role, how I've succeeded, not just that I've succeeded, like gone through my processes of how I've succeeded, what I'm going to bring to the team. Here's what I've taught everyone else. Here's some of the stuff I've done to prepare, like running discovery calls, getting their feedback on that. And that was really it. I didn't have to do anything too outside the box, but a lot of reps just don't even do that. They just think their numbers are good enough to get them there. Here's the little twist on my SDR to AE experience. So I was supposed to promote like on the year mark. Like that was pretty standard. If you had done well on SDR, you promoted right at that 12-month mark. About 3 days before I was supposed to join, there was a restructuring in the group. It wasn't like a layoff, but they were like restructuring the go-to-market. So the position I was supposed to join no longer existed, and this impacted like more than just me. It was quite a few SDRs that were slated to promote. And it ended up taking about 3 months to figure out, and I ended up joining a different part of the business. So it technically took me 0 to 15 months before I actually promoted to that account executive role. And I know a lot of you listening, I see it all the time. There's this obsession with how fast you promote. And it's like when you're new, it's like that's all you can think about. Like, I want to be that rep that promoted in 9 months, the first one in company history to do it. and you have all these peers that you're competing against. But it's just funny because I'm 6 years in now, you're around that mark too. It's like the difference between promoting from like 9 months in or 12 months in or 10 months in to 15 months in, it literally ends up making no difference in the end. As long as you keep doing the right things, they're like literally zero difference. But people get so worked up about this and so frustrated. And I know the reason I bring this up is because I know, and speaking to a lot of you, there's a lot of people on that hump where they're at their 12, 14 month mark and they think it's the end of the world that they don't have this clear path ahead to the account executive role and that their career was a failure because they weren't that rep who can post on LinkedIn about being like the first one to promote in 8 months. So that would be my advice, because back to the market point, I think it's like in 2018, it might have even taken, or sorry, if I was doing that now, this is a different market than it was for the last 5 years. A lot of times, like, you have done the right things, you are going above and beyond in their headcount issues where they're reducing the amount of account executives. But if you're doing the things we talk about and going above and beyond, you still are able to land jobs, and that's what we've been working on.
Yeah, and I think, like, last note on that point too, I see a lot of SDRs make a huge mistake when they're coming up on a year mark. They feel like there's no promotion in sight. There are certainly situations where, excuse me, that like your management just keeps dangling the carrot and there's nothing there. But I see so many people, as an example, that'll get 12 months in at a really great company, a Snowflake, an Okta, I don't know, a Ramp or whatever it might be, right? Just pulling names out of a hat. But they get there and they're like, man, my manager just told me I'm going to promote in 6 more months. And they make an irrational decision to go to some dog shit startup or whatever it might be that's going to pay them to be an inside sales AE. Or we have people at, you know, AWS that have done really well for themselves where they didn't see a path, but they still are an SDR or associate account executive. However, they're at AWS, like argue like with Oracle, with Google, like best companies in the world to actually go to. They more or less doubled their OTE. And even though they're still an SDR, technically they have AWS on the resume now. And I see so many people that will just, they get a year in, they feel underappreciated because they see morons in their eyes that aren't working as hard as them, making 2 or 3 times the money, and that may or may not be the case. But when you're right on the cusp and you start to get impatient, I've just seen so many irrational decisions that handicap you and set you back 2 years when you otherwise, I mean, I'm not even saying don't go externally, but if you take the first offer that you get, or you know, you want to be the founding AE of some company that started in Asia and you're going to be the first North American rep with like 180K OTE, you are guaranteed to fail. So I don't know how deep we want to get into that topic, but I think it ties in really nicely to what we've talked about, because like if the way that I think about it is, if you're at a year to 18 months in and there's no promotion in sight, you've got to be brutally honest with yourself first and foremost. Were you in the top 10% of attainment? Okay, check. And if not, you got to get there. Were you building an internal brand? And I don't mean just like cool with your team and your AEs. Does someone in marketing know who you are? Does someone that would not be your hiring manager know who you are? Does your hiring manager know who you are, and have you had multiple conversations with them? Have you built out like relationships with account executives who are trying to get you noticed by other people? And if you haven't done that, stop complaining. Like, if you have not exhausted every single route internally, and when you think you have, I might add, you're probably 50% of the way to actually exhausting every possible opportunity internally. So that's what I would tie off that section with. I think so many people get impatient, they make an irrational decision, they start playing the victim, like, oh, this is rigged, they're never gonna promote me and all this shit. And while that can be true, I'm definitely sympathetic to it. More times than not, you have not taken the effort to do literally everything in your power to position yourself as the best candidate to promote. So, yeah.
No, this is a topic like I've weighed heavily too. And I think a lot of reps, you have to mentally bank that you're going to have to do this for a certain period of time without any clear end in sight. A lot of reps, they'll do everything we just said, like get hyper focused and do it for like a week and then be like, where's the offer? Like, where is it? And it can take months, and you just have to trust that if you keep doing the right things, they will end up taking care of you. And I've seen so many reps quit just before they were probably gonna get that promotion. I've seen it happen internally, and this has always been a conversation I've weighed, because I think the general rule of thumb is like, you have the big companies on one end, the smaller companies. A lot of people who work at the bigger companies, you can generally go get that little base bump or a little pay bump by moving to a startup or a smaller company. So the second, I see it all the time at the big companies, like the second they think the game is rigged or that there's no path forward, which is usually just an irrational thought, but the second they do that, they immediately make that jump for like a pretty trivial base salary increase, when in reality, if they had just stuck it out, gotten to that next level at the big company, then when they make the jump, instead of it being a little base, like the more you can stick it out at the bigger company, that jump is always there for you. But if you see the path forward, in my opinion, what I recommend for people who work at larger companies is if you can get to that next path in a reasonable time, do it. And then yes, eventually there could be a time to make the jump. But okay, so I guess to close this off, maybe this is where we end, is I guess could you restate in like a clear, concise form, simple is better, what you recommend an SDR begin doing to prepare for that transition in advance and give themselves the best opportunity to actually get that promotion when the timing's right?
Yeah. And let me try and riff this off the cuff. I don't have a spreadsheet for it. But basically the first 6 months, just focus on hitting your number, build really tight feedback loops with your account executives. So you build up really honest and open communication with them, both good and bad. They can tell you if you're, not like why you're failing, quite frankly. From there, I'm going to start to, as I get to the 6-month mark, start to listen to gong calls of top performers, whether they're my AEs or different. All I'm going to care about is top performers. I'm going to use that to enhance my cold calling skills, use that to hopefully get to a point where I could run a few discovery calls on my own. And then also, this is where I feel a lot of people misstep. When you get about 6 to 9 months in, and this really helped me, even when I was an AE, because I was my own SDR for about 1.5 years as an AE as well, systematize what you have.
Yeah.
Like if you can't articulate why you are successful as an SDR, other than just saying, I hit the phones 100 times a day, I made more calls and emails than people, that does not translate to success as an account executive. So if you have not systematized your reporting, if you haven't put gates in place basically to be able to come back and do your SDR work more and more efficiently over time, that's a really big misstep as well, and something that I don't see people doing. Because when you get to an interview, and like I mentioned, if you're saying I did 20% more dials, 20% more emails, I'm willing to run through a wall, that only gets you so far. And if you're instead able to articulate, hey, the first 6 months of my role, I barely got by hitting quota, I still hit. But I found in the next 6 months I was in the role, that when I really focused in on these lead types, when I really found this type of an account, when I really found these buying signals or these types of announcements or this type of persona on LinkedIn that was using our competitor, they were always open to a conversation because of X, Y, and Z, or they were more likely to interact because of X, Y, and Z. So because of this, I created reporting. I did all of these different things, and you can actually see a noticeable increase in attainment from month 6 to 7 when I went and systematized my work.
Yep.
So that's probably the most tactical piece of this. And then obviously, like I mentioned, anytime you have FaceTime with not just your team, but broadly beyond your team, if you're ever presenting like a cold call script to an inside sales meeting, if you're ever on a marketing call, and you don't have to talk a ton, but if they're asking SDRs for feedback on how this webinar went or how high quality a lead is on these types of things, if you're providing very insightful feedback, that's great, but now follow up on that. Make sure if the marketing person really liked your feedback, ping them after the call and just say, hey, if you have any other questions about that, let me know, but I think it's working really well. Whatever it might be, start to just drop those threads of communication and actually follow up and make sure that you have, I would say as a good target, just to actually have a number, have 3 account executives that you don't support, be on like a first name basis with them. Yep. So they know who you are. Also with managers, depending on the size of your company, have at least one manager that's on the same level as the manager that you would work for that knows you very, very well. Also, as uncomfortable as it can be, start to get FaceTime with that manager and look for those opportunities where it's like the lowest barrier of friction. Because if you're the inside sales manager that's hiring me, and I hit you up in month 6 trying to get known, there's a right and a wrong way to do that. If I'm clearly fishing for like, hey, I want to work on your team someday, like, haha, you're like, you're not opposed to that conversation, but I'm also just 6 months in, right? And if the standard is 12 months, like, I don't have time to deal with this shit right now,
Yep.
right? So it's just looking for those opportunities to get to a point where you can get more and more FaceTime, But also, I'm just saying that because that's where I'll tie it off, because hopefully I was trying to be explicit and super direct. Hopefully that's not too wide. But I think like that's the biggest thing I see, going back to an earlier point. You get 9 to 12 months in and you're like, oh, I need to build my internal brand. And you've missed 6 months of opportunity to even just get noticed.
Yeah.
You know, and again, it doesn't mean that getting noticed is that 30-minute talk, that talking with them for an hour at a company happy hour or a company event. But if you're not taking every opportunity to just have them think like, oh, who is that SDR? Or like, oh yeah, that's the second time they've spoken up. They've always had really good things to say on meetings. Those are the types of things that if you're not taking every advantage and opportunity to do, it's gonna be that much harder. It's gonna feel more awkward and forced by the time you're at that 12-month mark and now trying to build a brand out of desperation because you realize your colleagues have done it 10 times better than you. So
that's spot on.
Yeah.
That's what it ends up being when you haven't been doing that throughout the course of the year. It just kind of reeks of desperation and it comes from the wrong place. I think articulating and being able to systematize why you've been successful is the most important thing. I think it's first, get really good at the job. Like that first 6 months, get good at the job, get your systems in place. Then once you have your systems in place, now you're able to communicate why you're successful. Because when you're a manager, like it's almost like interviews when you're breaking into tech sales. Once you're being put in front of the manager probably knows you're pretty good at your job. And now they're looking at one rep who's 193% of their quota and another that's 167%. But the one at 167% is able to clearly articulate at every layer why they've been successful. And if they're going to choose that rep over the 193% who did better, if they can't do that every single time, and it's not even going to be close, because everyone knows like there's different territories, like things can be a little different. There can be slight discrepancies. Like that rep could have had a tougher territory, but if they're able to clearly communicate why they've been successful, it's a slam dunk choice over the one who did better than them on paper if they can't do that. So
I think you bring up a great point. Just calling that out, that's a really strong one as well. If you know the historical performance of your territory and you can articulate that you doubled that result or 1.5x, even if you covered Iowa. And Iowa's, not the most technically advanced place in the world, right? Which is fine. But if you hit 120% of your number, but the last 2 SDRs that covered Iowa only hit 60% and they're no longer with the company, that is way more impressive than someone who covers like Texas or someone who covers California or New York and hit 200% of their number. But on the surface, to a manager at a big company seeing a spreadsheet of results, sees 120, 200, 200, 200, they're naturally going to be drawn towards those 200% attainment points. So these are the things you have to do to really stand out. And I would be blown away. And so many SDRs that would cover those smaller territories would come in with an inferiority complex. I'm not saying you come in and say you're better than them, but to your point, if you can articulate that, hey, I hit 120% of my number. I know it's not the highest in the company. The previous 2 SDRs, the most they'd ever hit in 22 and 23 was 60% attainment. I hit 120% this year, and here's how I did it. That's amazing compared to the SDR who covers New York and is like, yeah, broke into some of the biggest names in the world, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, New York Life. Like, yeah, really just, grinded it out, really did what I had to do. I knew I had to come in here and put my head down, and that's what I did. Yeah. Like, who are you going to pick to be your account executive and put on a good territory?
Mm-hmm. No. So it's a great point. I guess one other thing I'll tie off on too, because I like that point you brought up about being on a first name basis with like 3 account executives, because I think another way to naturally start having those conversations with the manager without coming off as desperate is if your cup is so full, like you have that SDR job on such lockdown, you have your systems and processes in place, that you're able, this could be a way to get on that first name basis, is to help people, like help account executives not on your dollar, like doing some of that stuff, just getting familiar with the territory. And a lot of those account executives are open to it, and they've been in your shoes. A lot of them were less than a year ago were in your shoes trying to promote to the account executive role. Not everyone, but a lot of them are happy to have someone help them out in their territory and do things like territory planning, prospect on behalf of them. Now when you go to that manager, instead of just saying like, hey, I want to promote, I want to be on your team, you can say, here's what I've done. I know John, Dan, and Sydney, and I've been doing this for them. Here's why I want to join your team. Here's what I've learned. Like, can we set up a conversation? That's a much more natural way for that to occur than it's the 12-month mark, the manager's never heard of you before, and all of a sudden you want to start joining their team calls. Like, that's where it starts to come off the wrong way. So it's the little things. We talk about this even in interviewing for landing an SDR job in the first place. It's not overcomplicating it. I think it's get good at the job, know why you're good at the job, use why you're good at the job to help people on those account executive teams start building your brand, and then that will help you naturally lead into starting conversations with those managers. And if you're just doing simple things like that, you're putting yourself above like 80-90% of SDRs trying to make that move. So
yeah. No, for sure. And I'd say like this is why higher levels exist, right? We have tons of top performers at AWS, Oracle, Snowflake, Okta, Rubrik, et cetera, that are trying to make this move and getting that outside opinion. People who have been there, done that before. That's exactly what we do. And we help people make this transition effectively. And obviously, if you made it this far in the video, Connor's got some dank content. We got more of this coming your way as well. So make sure to like, subscribe, do all those things. Really helps him and helps us. Like we do this on the side of our day jobs. It takes a lot. So we don't even care if you join higher levels or not. That's really not the intention of this. We just give the advice we wish we had 5 years ago. So definitely like, subscribe, and comment too. We watch these actively. So if there's anything we can help with, you want to shout us out in the comments, yeah. But unless there's anything else, just wanted to.
No, this has been great. Appreciate your perspective on this. I know the audience will as well, and we'll keep doing this going forward. So I hope you guys got value out of this one, and we'll see you on the next one.
See you guys.